rises to the surface almost immediately in Herman Melville's works such as Moby-Dick is the way that Melville adopts and recontextualizes biblical material. This reformatting of the Bible appears on the character level with borrowed biblical names such as Ishmael, Ahab, and Elijah that use reader familiarity with these names to encode additional meaning. And yet Melville also plays with this idea a little bit. So when Ishmael comes on board the Pequod and he finds out that his captain is named Ahab, he immediately jumps to the biblical Ahab and thinks that he's going to be this negative, domineering tyrant. And yet then Peleg tells him not to jump the gun, not to jump to conclusions, and says, quote, Captain Ahab did not name himself, and that he should, and also that Ishmael should, quote, wrong not Captain Ahab because he happens to have a wicked name. And yet, Ahab does become the tyrant and the anti-religious figure that in every way lives up to the biblical Ahab. So I think Melville very much wants us to associate Ahab with Ahab, but he wants us to do that on his terms. And I think that's also the way that he uses the Bible throughout Moby-Dick and throughout his other works, is using them in a slightly alternate way and having you come toward them in a different way. So Moby-Dick itself is structured much like the Bible, with multiple genres such as sermons, plays, including Mapple's sermon is where I got the title, the quotation for my title, and encyclopedia entries and short stories and so on. So there is a lot of scholarship on how Moby-Dick specifically is a biblical counterpart or a Third Testament. Craig Swankin observes in his chapter on Melville and the Bible that Melville is, quote, revising and transforming biblical material as part of his project of writing a uniquely American pluralistic scripture. And then Zachary Hutchins, whose article is called Moby-Dick is the Third Testament, notes that saying that Melville, quote, presents his novel as a counterpart to the religious message of the New Testament. And he even points to how beyond the other multitude of forms and genres that Melville uses in Moby-Dick, there's also Queequeg, the story of the wheelbarrow that Queequeg tells is very much like a parable. So there's even on that level some similarities. So if Melville is clearly echoing the Bible in Moby-Dick, why not extend that a bit to the rest of his work and increase that umbrella and say that he's using it on his work on a larger sense? And that's what I propose here. Given that Moby-Dick is situated by various scholars as either a subversive rewriting of, or at the very least a proposed additional testament to the Bible, what happens if we extend our sights beyond Moby-Dick and include other texts in this biblical vision? Zachary Hutchins asserts that it is absurd to say that Melville is deliberately mapping his work to a biblical vision. Quote, no one could seriously suggest that Melville shapes the cumulative products and trajectory of his career into a biblical model. And I would say that I agree with him in that you can't say that Melville sat down at the beginning of his career and decided that he would plot all of his works to fit with the biblical model. That would be kind of crazy and not in a good way. A lot of his works changed while he was writing them. For instance, he says that Pierre was going to be a rural bowl of warm milk, which with all the incest and with all of the two-part structure of the story and the negative things that happen in the story itself, it definitely does not seem to have taken that shape in the end. Similarly, with Billy Budd, what he writes at the end of his career, it started off as kind of an introductory prose headnote to a poem, which then slowly the headnote grew longer and longer. So I don't think that Melville's sitting down and deciding that each of his books are going to have a one-to-one correspondence with the Bible. It's not that Typee is his version of the Pentateuch, or that his poems are his version of Psalms, or that Claril is his version of Psalms, but rather that he's creating his own typology between his books, where he reuses certain images. And Hutchins kind of says something similar. He notes that Melville uses the Bible to the extent that it becomes a scriptural undercurrent to his corpus. Melville's work is, quote, so saturated with scriptural references that his entire corpus seems a type of Third Testament, encompassing and extending the Bible. Biblical typology, as defined by Melville scholar Jonathan Cook, is, quote, a method of biblical exegesis in which persons, events, and objects in the Old Testament, denominated types, were interpreted to prefigure corresponding antitypes in the life and ministry of Christ. And Cook's research focuses on Melville's use of typology within his short stories, which definitely shows that Melville was familiar with typology to some extent. In both of his short stories, The Two Temples and The Apple Tree Table, Cook notes that Melville uses lots of Old Testament references and imagery in the first half of the story, and then references specifically related to Christ and the resurrection in the second part of the story. Which is interesting in stories like The Two Temples, where the first part of the story is actually taking place within a church, and the speaker sees a picture of Mary and the Madonna and child, and he says that that's Hagar and Ishmael. So he's very clearly transposing things into this Old Testament vision in that story. So because of this, I know that I can see Cook's research suggests that Melville is familiar with typology in the way that he's structuring his stories. But I would like to take it a step further than that to suggest that Melville is actually fashioning his own typology and his own typological images between his books. And one place that I think that we should start in order to see how he would do this or why he would do this is in his reading of the scripture. Because he seems to see the scripture not as a divinely inspired text necessarily, but as a text that is more constructed and fashioned expertly so. And so he can use that structure and model it in his own works. You can see that this in some of his more skeptical reading of the Bible. Melville, lots of readings about Melville and religion put him all over the map. I think that Hawthorne's quote about Melville being someone who can neither believe nor be confident in his unbelief is something that's very much the backbone of that, but he's been placed in several different positions as far as his religious views. But in his reading of the book of Job, he writes at one point by some other hand, suggesting that he thinks that there's multiple authors for the book of Job. And that connects, as Swankin notes, to the higher critics who saw the Bible more as composed by multiple authors and not as unified or divine as it seems on the surface. And this perception of the Bible as a created thing that can potentially be emulated may also be the reason for Melville's intense response to Revelation 22:18-19, which discusses the penalties that come from adding to or taking away from the scripture. Quote, "If any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away from him his part out of the book of life." It is erased now. I was very tempted to show you Melville's annotation here because it's really interesting, but you actually kind of have to squint to see it. But the second part of the verse that says, "Don't remove or take books remove from the prophecy," he crossed out individually each line, drew through each line, and then drew an X through the whole thing. So he had very strong feelings about that. And then, and that's the second part of the verse. He also had an annotation or comment underneath that, which has been completely cut out of the Bible. And so I have to wonder, apart from the irony of trying to remove a verse that says not to remove from Scripture, I think that he was also, his annotation there may have been adding to Scripture, and I think that he was arguing with the fact that he wanted to see the possibility of being able to add on to Scripture and expand on it in that way. And so he's both adding to and taking away from Scripture in his interaction with this verse, which suggests that he sees the Bible as something that you can add to or take from. And that is where I think that it would come into my research. Melville suggests that Moby-Dick and possibly other works by himself are quasi-scriptural when he writes to Hawthorne about the fleeting nature of popularity and says, quote, "Though I wrote the Gospels in this century, I should die in the gutter." And it's true that Melville was probably joking to Hawthorne, saying like, "Oh, even if I wrote the Bible, no one's going to read it." But there is this sense that he sees his books as a sort of pseudo-gospel or pseudo-scriptural. And then Melville also is hinting at an equivalence between his writing and an authority of biblical texts. And then typology would be part of that. So in order for Melville to create a typology in his works that is separate from but also a recreation of biblical typology, Melville would need to create figures or images that take on one meaning in the context of a solitary text, but would take on additional meanings when you put that text in conversation with the second text. And one place where you can see this, so in the Bible you can see this with events like Moses in the Old Testament becomes a recreation of a Christ figure in the New Testament once you put those two together. Or the Passover in the Old Testament is, if you're just reading the Old Testament by itself, which of course you would if you're Jewish and you're reading it as the Hebrew Scriptures, then it's the story of the Passover. It's its own self-contained thing. But then if you're adding in the New Testament and the Gospels to that, then Christ is in some ways recreating the Passover, but with Christian undertones. And so the way that Melville does this in his works, I see, particularly comes out in his relationship between Typee and Moby-Dick. So the first thing I see in that is in the act of smoking a pipe, which happens in both Typee and Moby-Dick. In Typee, smoking a pipe is a communal activity. So it's the Typee people often sit in a circle and they pass the pipe from person to person. Something that Tomo notes after their meal, quote, "We regaled ourselves with the soothing fumes of tobacco inhaled from a quaintly carved pipe which passed round the circle." And Tomo mentions it later on in the text once again when he says, quote, "A pipe was lighted which passed from mouth to mouth." And then in addition to that, the Typee are very surprised to see Tomo just smoking a pipe all by himself, the whole pipe completely, because they're the kind of people that, quote, "only smoke a whiff or two at a time and at long intervals, and who keep their pipes going from hand to hand continually." So they see smoking a pipe is not a solitary activity. It's not even necessarily a leisure activity. It's very much a communal activity. And so this event doesn't have that much importance in the book of in the book Typee by itself, but I think it takes on a much stronger meaning once it's attached to Moby-Dick, when Queequeg and Ishmael echo the practice of communal pipe smoking after their friendship begins in the Bosom Friend chapter. So immediately after Ishmael becomes friends with Queequeg, first of all, he mentions it as a redemptive experience. He says, I felt a melting within me. No longer was my hardened hand against the outside world. The soothing salve had redeemed it. So there is this redemption that takes place in that chapter. And then almost immediately after that, he's the one that suggests it, that they smoke a pipe together, Queequeg's pipe. Quote, "Soon I proposed a social smoke, and producing his pipe and tomahawk, he quietly offered me a puff. And then we sat exchanging puffs from that wild pipe of his, and keeping it regularly passing between us." So he has it in there as a social activity passing between two people, almost exactly like the Typee. Even though Queequeg himself isn't officially considered Typee, his culture is very similar to the Typee culture that Melville describes in Typee. And so then and this also shows Ishmael's efforts to integrate into Queequeg's culture, because he's the one that suggests it, and he's the one that's embracing that side of himself. And then additionally, beyond that, I think we can look at Ahab's disposal of his pipe and attaching that to the typology here, because he casts his pipe away, and even though he focuses on it mostly as something that can soothe him, as a leisure activity that he doesn't have time for in pursuing the whale. And I think a couple of people have looked at the differences between at Ishmael and Queequeg smoking a pipe together versus Ahab throwing his pipe away by himself. But I think adding in Typee adds an interesting third dimension to that, because you can see how communal, beyond even just a community of two, the pipe smoking is supposed to be. And then Ahab throwing that away, he's becoming the domineering captain that says that all of his crew members are just a part of his own body. He says, you are my own arms and legs, so obey me. And then another place that Melville uses his own typology is through tattooing as well. In Typee, after Tomo's been living among the Typee for a while, the Typee began to ask him to tattoo his skin. And he is very much against it. And it's not just that he doesn't like getting a tattoo. I mean, I can sympathize with that. But he really doesn't want to, because he thinks the process will permanently scar him, will prevent him from integrating into regular American culture after that point, and that he would have to permanently consider himself one of the Typee. Quote, "A fact which I soon afterwards learned augmented my apprehension. The whole system of tattooing was, I found, connected with their religion, and it was evident, therefore, that there was a resolve to make a convert of me." So his opposition to getting a tattoo, he ties it more to religion here, that he doesn't want to be religiously converted to whatever the Typee believe their gods and goddesses. But it's also a refusal to join in and become a part of their culture. And so also the Typee's persistent search urging for Tomo to receive a tattoo is what begins his frantic search to find a way to leave the Typee settlement. Quote, hardly a day passed but I was subjected to their annoying requests until at last my existence became a burden to me. The pleasures I had previously enjoyed no longer afforded me delight, and all my former desire to escape from the valley now revived with additional force. So Tomo mentions, in the story, Melville mentions that Tomo has other reasons for leaving. He says that he finds this skull that's been cannibalized, and that seems to be a source of anxiety, but it seems like at that point he has already characterized the Typee as other and does not want to be joined in or become a part of them. So at that point I think he's just fishing for excuses in a way. And Samuel Otter also notes that it's a cultural fear that Tomo has when he says, quote, Tomo was afraid not of theological conversion, but of racial conversion. Tattoos are engrafted upon white skin as though the operation involved a translation of living tissue from Polynesian to American. And yet we see a dramatically different picture in Moby-Dick when first there's Queequeg's tattoos, which Ishmael sees, and he is a little bit anxious about them as well in this Founder Inn. But then after embracing Queequeg and Queequeg's culture, Ishmael just casually mentions in the middle of Moby-Dick that he has a tattoo. Quote, the skeleton dimensions which I shall now proceed to set down are copied verbatim from my right arm where I have them tattooed. And then Ishmael also says he wishes to leave the rest of his body blank so that he can use it as a canvas for a poem. So clearly Ishmael's not too concerned about being permanently marked or permanently othered through tattooing. And he's integrated into Queequeg's culture by embracing that. So then what's the purpose of these? Why would Melville create his own typology and repurpose the Bible in the way that he does? And I think that if there is a gospel or a church of Melville going on here, I think that the way we can find that is in the way that Melville reworks communion in these stories as well. And the way that Melville sees communion as a communal activity. So he focuses on the communal part of communion. In a letter to Hawthorne, Melville writes, quote, I feel the Godhead is broken up like the bread at the supper, and we are the pieces. Hence this infinite fraternity of feelings. So in that letter, he's connecting communion, the ceremony, to actually having human brotherhood and connection. And then we can see that happening in Moby-Dick as well. In the Squeeze of Hands chapter, even though it's not explicitly a communion ceremony, there is this interconnection that is very similar when Ishmael is squeezing down the spermaceti globules with his crewmates. Quote, I found myself unwittingly squeezing my co-laborers' hands in it, mistaking their hands for the gentle globules. Such an abounding, affectionate, friendly, loving feeling did this avocation beget. Come, let us squeeze hands all around. Nay, let us all squeeze ourselves into each other. Let us squeeze ourselves universally into the very milk and sperm of kindness. And this is definitely read through queer readings and homosocial readings, but I think that you can also see a very religious undertone to this of a transcendent unity that all of these people are experiencing as they engage in this activity at the same time. And that also there's this breaking down of boundaries and this shared sense of community. Melville also uses alternate communion in his short story, The Two Temples, when the narrator spends the first half of the story, he's just trying to find a church to go to. But because he looks like he can't afford to rent a pew there, they don't let him into the service, and so he's excluded from that. In the second half of the story, he's abandoned by himself in London, where he's given a free ticket to the theater, and when he sits down in the theater, he's offered a drink from this child, where he says he can't pay for it, and he tells the child this, but the child says, oh, it's okay, you can have it because my father's in America trying to make a living. So that is very much, the child is kind of taking on the attributes of Christ, that they have this shared connection to his father. And right after that, he has this feeling of love and connection and serenity in the theater. Quote, with an unhurt eye of perfect love, I sat serenely in the gallery, gazing upon the pleasing scene around me and below. And he doesn't worry about class differences at that point, even though it's a theater where there's lots of different classes, and there's people sitting in the rows closer to the presentation that are wearing all these jewels, and so there is this socioeconomic division there. But he doesn't pay attention to that at this point. He just notices how they're all sharing in the access to the theater, and they're all participating in it together. And he feels unhurt in spite of the fact that he's been in London and he's just been abandoned by people that were supposed to be paying his way. And he doesn't even have anywhere to go after he leaves the theater. And so there's this strong emphasis on connection and on community that I think comes from these pseudo-communion ceremonies. As the others notes in his book on Melville and religion, quote, "There is for Melville a sense of universal human communion that transcends racial, cultural, and religious difference." And so I think love is the significant theme in Melville's works that highlights the need for communal experience and something that transcends class or racial boundaries. We see that in Moby-Dick when Ishmael says that the reason that he needs to help Queequeg worship his idol is because of following love your neighbor as yourself. Because of following that golden rule, he feels like he should give up maybe practicing some of the more written things of Christianity where you need to worship your own gods and not worship other gods. So the loving your neighbor as yourself is more important. And then also Ahab refusing to help the captain of the Rachel, they also invoke the idea that Ahab should be doing that, and that's one of his most grievous mistakes, is that he doesn't love his fellow captain and help him at that point. Also, so beyond the examples that I've shared here from Type, Moby-Dick, and the Two Temples, there is also within that and beyond an anger at social divisions. In Type, Melville definitely levels a lot of anger towards the missionaries that aren't necessarily just there to give Christianity. They're also treating the natives in a way that Melville thought was horrendous, like using them to pull carts and things like that. And then also in the Two Temples, there's definitely a lot of anger towards the fact that people have to rent a seat in a church. People should be able to go into a church and just be equal there and not have to rent a pew. And so Melville's use of typology that extends through and beyond Moby-Dick reveals his desire to share a gospel devotion and affection that embraces individuals instead of fixating on cultural and socioeconomic divisions. Melville subverts scriptural formatting in his works in order to bring us to one central religious tenet that should have been the focus all along: love. Thank you.